a sense of community when you're free. Rolling through the mountains, rolling through the valley, rolling through paradise with me.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Small Talk. Well, my guest is an author from Ottawa, Ontario. As a matter of fact, she has a series of 6 books, and it's called the Crimson Fantasies. On her profile page, it says, Crimson Fantasies are part bloodbath and part bubble bath. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to meet Patricia McCarthy. Welcome, Patricia.
Welcome, Nancy. Thank you for having me on Small Talk.
Oh, you're welcome. Putting out 6 books is pretty awesome.
It took a decade worth of work. So I call it, you know what? That is my BA and my master's combined.
Very good.
Because that was a decade of my life. So
wow, very good. So, okay, what motivated you to start to begin with?
Well, I get asked that question a lot.
Yeah.
And as I tell people, I think, and they're always wondering, you know, when did you start to write? How did you know you were a writer? And there was no actual conscious connection. My mom always reminded me, she said, when you were 6 years old, we would go visit some family friends for dinner, and they had in their basement this manual clunker. And she said, you would always go down there on your own. Nobody taught you how to type, and you would start typing out short stories. And so I said, oh, Mom, that's awesome. And I remember doing it. Did you save any of them? Oh, no, I threw them all out because Air Force, right? Air Force brat, we moved a lot around. And then as I got older, in my 20s, I was writing short stories. And then I began to write poetry in my 30s. And then I was selling some to magazines, and one magazine in Roswell, Georgia, asked to buy some of my poems for their magazine. So I was happy to sell them. And I was selling individual poems in Canada and the UK for magazines while I was still working full time. And so this one magazine in Roswell, Georgia said, you know what? We have got some vampire magazines. Would you like to write some short stories for us? So I wrote some, and I submitted them. I never expected them to be bought and published, but that's how it happened. And then I realized, oh my God, this is such a fun mythology. I'm having so much fun with it that I decided to write my first novel. And so it comes under the classification of urban paranormal. So you think of speculative fiction, which is science fiction, and within speculative fiction, there's a subgenre. It's called fantasy. And within fantasy, there are subgenres within fantasy. One of them is urban paranormal, which means you are depicting humans coexisting with a supernatural creature. But they call it urban paranormal because it has to be set in a contemporary city. And so my story was set in Ottawa because I love this city. And of course, we have Parliament Hill. It's the nation's capital. There are a lot of vampires up in Parliament Hill. So that's how it started. I had one vampire. And then when I was done the first novel, I thought, you know what? I'm not done yet. And before you know it, 10 years goes by and 6 novels. Yeah.
So in each of the novels, like you wrote the first one, does the second one have any of the same characters and so on?
Yes. Yeah. All the same characters are carried throughout novels 1 through 6. And I love the series, but now I'm starting to ramp up novel 7 from the perspective of I've been writing it for 9 years, and the first draft is done. It's 265,000 words.
Okay.
And I'll be actually handing off a copy to the principal editor this week to begin that brutal editorial process.
Right.
Principal editing, copy editing, proofreading, and then you start that whole process. Yeah.
Yeah. So is it hard to get books, any books published?
I don't think so. No, not in today's market. So there's a bit of a difference, right? You can become an indie author, not the same as I always say it's a misnomer to refer to an indie author as somebody who's self-published,
Right.
because self-published implies you're doing it all on your own. An indie author, very much in the arts community, like indie musicians, indie filmmakers, but the arts community is less likely to embrace an indie author. And the way I always say, we subcontract out everything. So I have to hire principal editor, copy editor, proofreader, graphic design for the cover.
Right.
I have to hire a web designer to redesign my site. So there are all these elements, and that's what makes it, indie publishing. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Can you tell me about some of the characters in your books?
Yeah. So are you talking about my Crimson Fantasies now?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, so with the Crimson Fantasies, it begins with how the couple, they kind of find each other, and how his sort of lineage has a dark secret from the perspective of he is a hybrid vampire. So, and then I introduce this old vampire who's 927 years old, and
Right.
his name is Sir William Simon Hennessy. And what he has done is he cannot create other vampires, because I wanted to do kind of a twist on the mythology. He can kill them and drain them, and that's how he survives.
Okay.
But it's because I read an article about a mathematician talking about the stupidity of the whole vampires creating other vampires, that within 2 years, the entire human population would be decimated because of the exponential factor. If one vampire bites another vampire and they change the next person and so on, there would be nobody left. So I thought, okay, I'm not going to do that. He won't be able to create other vampires, but like all species, he's compelled to want to propagate his species. So he starts trying to change the fetus, an unborn fetus, in a woman who's 9 months pregnant, but almost all of them die. And so, with the exception of one living in Ottawa, a hybrid vampire. And so it begins that way, where he meets the love of his life, and then the characters start to develop around that. And then at some point in time in Ottawa, this one and only vampire comes into the city of Ottawa to finally communicate with his, hybrid vampire son. And so that's how the story continued. And he eventually, this one and only vampire, when he dies, then and only then is he able to transfer his remarkable powers to one person that he chooses. And so that's what the whole story is predicated on.
Okay, so is that character do you predict that character as a good character?
Good question. He's diabolical because it's not very nice, but I call him diabolical. So he has duality in character. He shows humanity towards all of humanity because he's supremely wealthy, but he gives away almost all of his money to charities and stuff. But because in order for him to survive, he has to drink blood, he does prefer to kill and drain women over men because he's a man, right? So in a way, yes, he is diabolical because he's indiscriminately killing people. And when he comes into the city of Ottawa, he basically, his hybrid son, his name is Samuel, and his wife's name is Magdalene. He basically turns their lives upside down completely just because of who he is.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool. Could you read a book independently of the other, or you have to read them in sequence?
Well, I wrote them like standalone pieces. Right. So when I go to events such as Comic-Con, because it's a fantasy exhibition, or they accept fantasy, and there used to be other events as well, like Ottawa Geek Market, but that is no more. I describe it to people and I go, it's a standalone story. You can start at any point in the series, enjoy it, bounce to the next one, and they will link up. I said, and some of them buy them at Comic-Con and they read them all backwards. Some start with number 6. They like it so much, then they go backwards. But each one has a bit of a different flavor. So I always tell people novels 1 and 2 I call them more cliterature than literature,
Right.
because it's very erotic elements. This is the couple finding each other. And it's so often the case of when a couple starts a new relationship, so much of it is about the sex in the beginning.
Yeah.
So I always say number 1 is kind of raw. Novel 2 is a bit rude. 3 is quite romantic. 4 is humorous because it's about a pub crawl where they're all going to all the pubs in Ottawa and they're getting increasingly more smashed. Number 5, I always describe as a little dark, and 6 has it all.
Cool. Now, I've interviewed a number of authors, and I'm always curious because everybody has a different system. Like I met one who they have to sit and just work for a certain amount of time. Boom, boom, boom.
Right.
Somebody else just makes notes all day long, whatever things come into their head, they make these.
Yeah.
So how does it work for you?
Well, I start off, I try to plot it out. So, and it's kind of like, I picked this up a technique because I subscribed to Writer's Digest magazine for over a decade. And I remember, and this was when I was still writing the short stories, and I remember the advice of one author in the US. His name was Simon Wood. And he said, break it down by elements. So say, for example, the average novel size is about 60,000 words. So he said, cut that in half. So he said, 30,000 words should represent the guts of your story. He said, then take the other 30,000 words, cut it in half again. 15,000 should represent the beginning of your novel, the introduction, where you set the dilemma or drama, you introduce the characters. He said, 15,000 words represents your conclusion. So he said, so now if you're working with 15,000 words to begin your story, to introduce your characters, the setting, the drama and dilemma, he said 15,000 words seems like a lot, but he said, break it down even more. So say, for example, a short story that you may be expected to write or submit, they could come back to you and say, it can be no more than 3,000 words. And that works out to double space because I wrote so many short stories for this vampire magazine, between 1,500 and 3,000 words, that might work out to 8 or 9 pages. So if you only have 15,000 words for your introduction, that's not a lot.
Right.
So then you can start to think about, okay, how many characters do I want to have in terms of protagonists, principal characters? And you can start to break it down that way. So I would always begin my novel with chapter titles. And what he would do is that he would have events and cut them out on a piece of paper, move them around on the table. And so I started to do that. I would have my chapters, as an example, for novel 6, chapter 13. I knew the event I wanted to happen, that I described it as Sir William takes Lady Catherine. And that was the entire description for the chapter. And so then you get to that point, you go, okay, now let me think about it logically. How does he take her? When does he take her? Where? How do they meet? And so when you start to think this way backward, then it starts to write itself. But all I needed as a trigger was that one sentence, because in novel 6, I go back in time to Ottawa in the year 1900. Because Ottawa has a really rich lumber baron history. And at one point in time, Ottawa was considered one of the most dangerous cities in the world. We didn't even have a police. We would bring in the military from Kingston. So that's how I would write the chapters. And if you think about it, average novel size is anywhere between 60 and 80,000 words. So novel 6 came in for me at 110,000 words. This is after all the editing. And that's why novel 7, to have it at 265,000 words, I knew it was a big book. So I had a little bit more latitude in terms of not feeling so rushed to roll out the whole story, that I could develop it. So the first series is urban paranormal. My seventh novel, I'm actually calling it a hybrid fantasy because I'm combining elements of urban paranormal with high fantasy. I'm creating a whole new world, but I have very delicate little tentacles that reach back to the first series. And you don't even have to read anything of the Crimson Fantasies to enjoy novel 7. And that's what it takes a lot of work to do that.
Right.
The elements, yeah.
So whenever you're writing anything and then somebody else has to edit it,
Yes.
how difficult is that for you? Because like I've written like just little things, you know, but it's like if somebody's changing it, it's like, well, wait a minute, those are my words. Why are you changing it?
Right.
Time processing. Did you go through that?
I agree. Yeah. Well, I think also too, having an understanding of the editing process. So say, for example, principal editing. Principal editing is about the overall thematic content of it.
Okay.
How is the story arc? How are the characters developed? The flow of the writing. You don't want your principal editor to come back and say, well, I've got to change all of this for grammar, tense, and punctuation. That's the copy editor's job. Theirs is purely forensic. They actually don't really digest the story the way you think they do. But the principal editor, if they're not concerned with the grammar, tense, and spelling, they can just read it for the sake of reading. And then they come back to you and say, and this has happened for me in novel 4. My principal editor said, I hate this character. She's coming across as a total bitch, pardon my language. And he said, and I've hated her since she came into the scene. And so that was a comment from a principal editor. And I thought, okay, I have to rewrite her. Took me 3 months to rewrite it. That one sort of character change to change dialogue, the way she came across. So that's what a principal editor can do for you. Yeah. And they can come back and say, well, I thought this scene was flat. Another example would be in writing novel 6, I had one scene and initially I thought it would be cool to include some historical information about I should say Ottawa's experimental farm. And so I had my major vampire. He had a bouquet of dandelions in the middle of winter in a room. And this was in the year 1900. And at one point, the editor came back and said, you just took me out of the scene when you started to provide the history from the experimental farm about the dandelions. And the editor's comment was, don't take me out of the scene. He's the ultimate vampire. He doesn't have to explain himself. He just has dandelions in the middle of winter. Leave it at that. So I went, okay. That whole paragraph was deleted. And I thought it was terrific because it sort of texturized it, but it wasn't. So that's what a principal editor will do for you. They'll kind of keep you grounded. Yeah.
Before you even got to that point where you're sending it off for editing, do you have anybody read it? Do anybody you know read it for you or read, not for you, go over it?
No, I don't. This is just how I work. I don't believe that any author should write to cater to an audience.
Right.
An author has to write the story that they want to read. I've always felt this. So I don't share it with anybody. And novel 7 has been 9 years. It's been my private world. Nobody's had any opinion about it. And that's the way I wanted it. Because I think it stymies you. All it takes is one person who is having a bad day, who just decides, I want to rain on your parade. And so they come back to you and they say, well, this is a shitty story. It's still in its process of being written, right? So it'll be massaged, and you make, I don't know, Nancy, if you have written a couple of novels.
No.
Okay. So part of that process when you're writing novels, you are your worst critic. You're the most critical of yourself. And so when you're writing a book, You write a chapter and then you go to the next chapter and you just continue. But at some point in time, you have to circle back and read it from the beginning. And so this is what happens in a really big book, that you will periodically make a complete pass through it and you'll go right back to the beginning. And I guarantee you'll read the first chapter and you'll say to yourself, I can't write. This is a horrible chapter. And then you go along and you'll come across another chapter. Oh my God, this was brilliant. Wow, what a great idea. So we oscillate on how we feel about our own work. Why would I subject it to somebody else to hack it to pieces until it's ready?
Good point. Yeah, good point. So once you finished your 7th novel for the series, are you moving on to writing something else?
God, I haven't even gotten there. I still write poetry. Because novel 7 has taken up so much of my life, well, I work full time as well. That has been enough for me, frankly. Like, so I finished novel 7, and as I said, I'm handing it off to a principal editor this week. But because I still like to keep, the writing juices going, I've started to post a small little blog on my X page. And I also repost it on Facebook as well. And so that just helps me to think a little bit differently, because it's more of a blog of personal observations and criticisms, and which is what a biographical log is all about, right? What's going on in your life.
So once your novels are out there, whether you're first or second, whatever, and family or friends have read them, do you think it's, do you like getting feedback from them? Once you've already published now, okay? So they're a good book, they're selling somewhere, in the bookstores, wherever. How do you feel about your family and your friends talking about them, about your
friends, I don't mind at all. Family, they have shown less interest, and that's okay, because I stopped kind of looking for their feedback years ago. It's just not everyone is into reading fiction or fantasy. And so that's fine. Some friends have, after reading my Crimson Fantasies, they came up to me and said, I don't know who you are. And I went, okay. I've had other friends, like one of my friends who has acted as a proofreader, kind of like an advanced reader copy. And she loves getting her red pen out, but she would read through them every time and she'd say to me, how do you come up with this shit? It's out of this world. And I go, well, that's a great compliment, right?
Yeah.
It's the same when you are selling at a fantasy exhibition like Comic-Con, because I love that, face-to-face contact, and they'll come up, and when it's a series, they might buy 1 or 2. And if they read them, then they'll come back and look for you again next year. Okay, now I want to buy the rest of the series. And it's the same with table mates beside me at Comic-Con. They'll buy 1, and then the next year they'll come and find me. Oh my God, I loved it. Now I've got to buy another one. So
there's nothing better than a good series of books.
Yeah. And some people who have read them, last year at Comic-Con in September, one woman came up and she said, my father bought your entire series. I said, oh, thank you for letting me. We confiscated it from him because we feel it's too inappropriate. And so we took the whole series away from him. And I thought, he's a grown man.
Yeah.
But he came up to my table after and he said, my wife was not happy that I bought your series because it was too sexy. So
no.
Exactly. You don't know. And I've had other men come up to me. I really loved your series, especially the first 2 books, because they were so sexy. And now on novel 3, you decided to take yourself too seriously. So you will not win, Nancy.
No, right. Yeah. Oh my God. It's like doing this. I get lots of good feedback, but every once in a while somebody will say something negative, like, oh, you're so flat. Like, what? I'm not.
You're so what? Flat. You're flat? Oh, but they talking about how you're interviewing.
Yeah. And right. I make a joke of it. And I said, I am not. I'm round,
Yeah, no, I totally agree. When you write the same way, if you interview, you come through it.
Yeah.
This is just who you are. If you're trying to present yourself as somebody that you're not, people will respond to it because people respond to sincerity and they smell it immediately. And I think it's the same with writing, right? If you're trying to pass yourself off as, somebody else, or I don't know, maybe you're trying to, I read a lot. Some of the stuff that some authors go through selling their work online, how one local author in Ottawa was posting it on Facebook, how, her book was doing well up on Amazon and somebody in another part of the world decided to copyright it. They took the whole thing, reposted it under a different name up on Amazon. And now there's an infringement case that's going on.
Wow.
So people will, I think that kind of truth comes to light very quickly.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, I think we're out of time. Oh my God, this has been so
That's
enjoyable.
quick.
It just goes so fast. I love this so much. But I'll make sure your website will be included so people can look you up and buy your books. And yeah, I did have a picture.
So much.
Where did I have this? I don't know how well it'll show. Whoops, I've lost it. I've got other things coming up on my phone, but I had a
Yeah,
picture
no worries.
of all of your books, and it looks so nice. The 6th, because you haven't finished it yet, the 7th. So, but anyway, I really appreciate you doing this with me. But stay on camera, So I'm just going to talk to the audience for a minute. And so everybody, you've been listening to Patricia McCarthy. Check out her books. It's so much fun to read people's books and a series. Like I said, if you like the first one, you're bound to like the rest of them. So
thank you so much, Nancy, for your time.
You're welcome. And thank you, everybody, for watching the show. I hope you continue to do so. Take care and peace out.
Thank you.
A sense of community, Chilliwack's a place to be. A sense of community where you're free. Rolling through the mountains, rolling through the valley, rolling through paradise with me. It's multicultural, you're sure to see it all. Chilliwack's the place to be, you'll see. Come party in the park, go dancing after dark. Chilliwack's the place to be, you'll see.